Welcome to this episode of Acclime Conversations. Today I'm with Binh Tran, who is the founder of Ascend Ventures Vietnam, an early stage venture capital startup looking at Southeast Asia investments, but also general partner of 500 Startups Vietnam, a seed stage investment fund. Binh, great to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to learning a bit about your story and a bit about the early stage investment scene in Vietnam. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Matthew. And I'm a co-founder of 500 Startups Vietnam and co-founder of AVV, and it stands for Ascend Vietnam Ventures. Okay. So slight correction.
Okay, I'll get that right. So before we go into those, I'd love to, first of all, in these conversations, lead out the story about yourself, the person. What brought you to where you are? Sort of a bit about your history, your education, your background, and how you've ended up in Vietnam, specifically looking at what you do. And we'll get into the businesses themselves shortly, but yeah, your story. I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you asked me 10 years ago, would I be imagining myself living in Vietnam, working out of Vietnam, I would have said no. I was born in District 1. I left when I was 1, right when the fall of Saigon, and then spent most of my life in the US. Started my career very early with computers. Started programming on this IBM XT that my aunt brought home. This is the probably late 80s. Yeah. So at age 13, I knew that software was the future for me. Received a computer science degree and spent the next decades building companies and building products and building teams.
In the US?
All in the US, all in software. And my last company, we had started in 2008. And we raised our A, B, and C rounds from Kleiner Perkins, which is at the time probably the best VC firm, regarded VC firm on the planet, and had a hyper growth story and exited the company in 2014. That's when I started to travel and learn a little bit more about ecosystems outside of the U.S. And I ran into my co-founder Eddie, and that. I would say partnership and his belief in Vietnam was infectious, and we teamed up, started 500 Stars Vietnam, and started to deploy capital out here in 2015.
Yeah. And Eddie is a very passionate person when you see him around doing presentations like yourself, and I can see how that works together. So let's move into sort of the 500 Startups of Vietnam, then AVV. They have different positionings, and one has led to the other, and there's, first and second funds effectively. Go through the story. I'd love to hear a bit about where that came from and what you're trying to achieve as you're maturing and as you're expanding your own ecosystem, so to speak.
Yeah, for me, I experienced something I call the software renaissance. That occurred in the early 90s in the US. Venture capital before that time was primarily hardware and biotech. Mm-hmm. And they introduced entrepreneurship to software engineers. And when you have entrepreneurs that can code, basically the cost of building companies and products and startups fall dramatically. And
there's no boxes you have to make.
Exactly. No chips you have to design and install. So that creates an inflection point of growth, and startups like Yahoo and Google were born, right? 10 years later, you see that kind of triggered in China. 5 years after that, India. And it was my belief that if you had a large enough pool of software engineers and there's entrepreneurship, the next ingredient here is venture capital. And that can trigger this renaissance in almost any ecosystem around the world. Vietnam had software outsourcing since the late 90s. And so plenty of software engineers.
And remains a strength today, the depth of the engineers in general, yeah.
And it didn't have that early stage tech-focused VC capital. I mean, IDG was started around 2004, but the market wasn't ready from an infrastructure standpoint. There wasn't enough downstream capital, just a little too early. And so for us, coming in and starting to deploy in 2015 was a little early. But we believed where the market was headed. And, really the entrepreneurship piece is kind of twofold. One, Vietnamese people are naturally entrepreneurial. But secondly, I think it's 2016 that the government said, hey, digital economy, entrepreneurship, startups, and that became the final piece to lead to where we are.
So did the 500 Startups Vietnam, which is the first versus Ascend Vietnam Ventures, the second thing, how did that change between the first and the second funds and the deployment? Because there's slightly different strategies and different markets you've looked at.
Yeah, when I think about the ecosystem in 2015, there wasn't much going on in Vietnam. I mean, there's been some companies started, local companies like Momo and Tiki, Sendo, as a response to international tech companies looking at Vietnam as a growth market, right? In 2010, the government really made Vietnam very much more accessible, and companies like Rocket Internet, Lazada, Grab, Uber, all started coming into the market. That triggered some of the very ambitious local entrepreneurs to start things. But it wasn't until 2016 and 17 that, with the push on the government, basically educating the country that startups is the future, that you started getting some volume. So in investing at that time, you didn't know where the founders were going to come from. You didn't know if there was downstream capital. And so the strategy was to be able to build a very large, diversified portfolio, very small ticket sizes. So some of these deals, we're looking at $25,000, $50,000.
So very early stage, small tickets, big potential, but you're taking significant risk.
Significant risk in terms of sectors as well. You know, where were the scalable sectors, and so small tickets, large portfolio. Yeah. That was the strategy.
And I'll talk later about some of the resource issues and sort of development issues. I love just from a macro point of view, where is Vietnam versus other parts of Southeast Asia? Because there's a huge ecosystem in Indonesia, been a lot more of your billion-dollar sort of companies coming out of there versus Vietnam, Philippines, etc., Thailand. Where's Vietnam sitting in a maturity perspective? Has it caught up to those? Is it in front in some aspects? Or have we still got a sort of a fair way to go given the low base and the late development that Vietnam's had in the tech and the sort of VC space?
It's the fastest growing, but it also is one of the youngest. And there's a Google Bain report that comes out every year. It says that Vietnam will reach 2/3 of Indonesia's size in terms of the digital economy to become the second largest digital economy within the region, with only 1/3 of the population.
I was going to say,
right?
There's some big numbers that are coming through.
So the growth has continued to match or exceed a lot of these analysts' research. And one of the things to note is that a lot of it has to do with how large the market is. And so most markets, except for Indonesia, really have to think about an international, either regional or global play from day one to be able to build, in my world, in the tech VC world, multi-billion-dollar outcomes. And Indonesia, with its demographics, attracted venture capital earlier. So if you think about 2017, here in Vietnam, about $40 million of venture capital deployed. Same year, Indonesia, over $600 million. And in 2021, before the correction of the tech market, $1.4 billion in Vietnam, which is the peak, the record. Yeah. Over $9 billion in Indonesia.
Still.
So you think about the scale of venture capital being an accelerant for a lot of these different companies. Indonesia just had its start earlier, had better demographics in terms of scale and size, and you had probably a lot of international investor interest come in. Now, where Vietnam is headed in terms of maturity rate, and the reason it's growing so fast is because it has such a large base of software engineers.
And is it that it's more accessible for investors to come in and more comfortable? Because that's something that we see versus Indonesia, which is higher entry point, more difficult in some cases to enter. Does that come into the play at all? Do people feel, to the people that are backing you, the funds that are sort of investing with you, do they feel that, or is it simply just opportunity driven alone?
That's my belief. I do think that there has been basically non-protectionist stance taken by the government. You saw this evident in starting around 2010, when foreign ownership limits were steadily removed across so many different sectors. And that signaled that Vietnam was an accessible growth market for anyone.
Yeah, the 2008 WTO session started it, and it's over time, and by sort of 2016, or as we have today, the vast majority were cleared.
Exactly.
And the tech space has been the classic there. And you mentioned before sort of Uber and Grab, and I sort of see them as a watershed moment where Uber came into market, there was no regulation, and push ahead. And people still refer back to the Uber, we're the Uber of something. And in Vietnam, we're just going to make it happen. We're just going to push the boundaries because we see an opening and we know regulation may follow or that may be something, but we're happy to push ahead. Does that help, that mindset help? You see that as part of what makes it successful? Or is the fact that Vietnam, we're sometimes working in a void, make it harder to give companies direction and sort of find those which are going to push ahead?
So entrance of international companies, looking at Vietnam as a growth market, I guess the near-term effect is that it becomes increasingly competitive for any local players to play. Mind you, these companies have raised billions of dollars, but that doesn't stop some of the local entrepreneurs to say, we can win here, right? There is this increased competition, but I think over time, there's an increase in knowledge sharing. Your employees have either worked for an international company or competed against an international company. So I think there's a faster maturity rate when markets become much more accessible. But one key thing about Vietnam, I think, is sometimes differentiating compared to other markets is that there is this equitable access. In other words, big conglomerates operating in markets that aren't heavily regulated, where it seems as if there's an even playing field. So they cannot bend the law to suit their needs, place artificial ceilings on competitors. Whereas some other markets, you do see some of these powerful families or conglomerates creating unfair business practices.
Monopolistic.
Exactly.
Duopolistic process. Yeah.
Exactly. And here you look across so many different sectors, you have international foreign companies in market-leading positions, and they're foreign companies, right? And I think it's absolutely needed for a country like Vietnam to continue to see 7, 8, 9% GDP growth.
Well, we have to. 6% we're doing at the moment isn't enough for what Vietnam needs to do to keep growing. It's the minimum needed. It's not the panacea for Vietnam's growth. So some of the areas you've been investing in with fintech, edtech, e-commerce, those areas, is that where the growth's going to be, or are there other areas that you're sort of going to come out in the near future that you're looking at now, given the early stage nature that you think is going to create the next billion-dollar company? What's the sort of view at the moment about sectors themselves?
Yeah, we are generalists. They call it a generalist fund, which means we don't particularly just narrow around certain sectors. That said, this is the next emerging Asia. Vietnam is part of this growing group of folks moving from low income into middle income. And there's giant millions of small businesses using the internet for the first time. So if you think about that trajectory, it's virtually almost every sector you could think of where technology adoption is inevitable.
So you've done healthcare, you've done distribution, all of those at touch points, consumer driven.
Yeah, I'd say what does a consumer need when they get that disposable income? If they have a smartphone in the pocket for the first time, they need healthcare, they need education, they need food, they need to be places, logistics, all these different things, kind of universal basic needs. Right? And you think about small businesses, being able to track their customers for the first time, be able to market them, and be able to be more efficient in understanding what they need, how to service them better, how to run their businesses with a lower cost basis.
And on that, so EdTech, for example, that I was reading before, there's more than 200 businesses trying to compete in the EdTech sector in Vietnam, and all trying to get a piece of the pie. are we reached the point of certain parts are oversaturated and you won't touch it, or do you still think there's opportunity even with large numbers pushing for certain areas to take a piece of that emerging pie and growing pie? And look, don't get me wrong, EdTech's fast growing. It's been 44% year on year, and it is a significant growth.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with EdTech, well, the challenge is almost any sector, is finding teams and innovation that is truly differentiating so that you can create a much larger outcome versus, you know, thousands of businesses that can reach $10, $15 million in revenue. It's fabulous for the founders.
Yeah, but there's a big runway you've got to reach
Yes.
beyond that.
Yes.
So how do you find those, and how do you identify those individuals that can take it, not just a 15 million, but $1 billion revenues? How do you work through the process to get those people at that early stage when there's no runs on the board?
Yeah, it really has to start with the people, and you know, some founders working in technology. You know, technology moves and changes the world, and often when you have a founder with some kind of ambition around technology, envisioning a future that doesn't exist, they can potentially create new markets and completely change behaviors of businesses and consumers. So for us, venture capital is really about investing in the non-obvious businesses,
okay,
the ones that are leveraging perhaps technology that wasn't here 2 years ago.
So more visionary people?
Yes, they're big, bold, visionary folks who are, I think, see the world as something they need to change, and they're doing it with, I would say, a mindset of learning. Because sure, you have a vision that you want to come to fruition. However, to get there, there's a lot of learnings. There's a lot of experimentation. And a lot of times you're going to be wrong.
And do you spend time with them constantly during the process? Do you bring others in, or do you let them to their own devices and just keep an eye on them? And how much involvement do you need to do, or your people that you bring to the table to help them on that journey?
Yeah, I think there's an understanding of founders during that first 2 years working in tech is that experimental, iterative journey. Really, it should be hands-off from an investor standpoint, right? They're the domain experts. They understand the problem they're trying to solve. They've got an idea and a list of experiments they want to be able to run. And they're going to move really fast and sometimes very sloppy. And that's okay. I think the speed aspect is really, really important. What an investor can do, I think, is be at the right places and the right junctions of time to make an outsized impact on the company's journey.
And then at that next stage, when the seed rounds or something else is coming, that's when things might change once they've proof of concepts and they've allowed time to mature their concept at least. Yeah,
I think about it as the capital journey, you know, being right there, right place, getting them the capital they need, helping them raise the next round. The second piece is really key people. You know, one of the first job is building the product. The second job is building out this team. Right? And so helping this founder understand how to create that type of organization, which is very different from most organizations you see in developing markets. And so crafting the organization of the future and letting your experience, coaching them on how to build that really very different organization to help them win. And then finally, help the founder, I would say, level up. Often they can be very technical or haven't put on the CEO hat.
Yeah, the introverted nature of the tech world, you must pull them out of that to be inspirational in many ways. Not just aspirational, they need to be inspirational.
Yeah, in the right way, you know. So having a strong relationship with there's a lot of psychological safety, a lot of trust, that those breakthroughs can happen for a founder. And that's one of the most enjoyable things of a job.
So how do you find them? Where do most of your opportunities that you end up investing or, you know, make those decisions regarding investing into your IC, where do they come from? How do they reach you? Is it referrals? Do you just go out and knock on doors?
Yeah, you can describe it as a funnel, like any sales funnel with multiple channels. Where it's now is very different from where it was before. Where it was before, no one knows you. And what you have to do is maybe be a little bit more of a targeted search, reaching out to folks who have this particular, perhaps this kind of background that you're looking for.
And at the same time, Eddie's up on stage doing the sales pitch constantly, and any opportunity he could to get the brand recognition, whilst there was that funnel in the background.
Yeah. So when you start, no one knows you. You really have to just hustle and get in front of great people. Two funds in, and 8 years later, it's a mix. Inbound, outbound. Us still targeting and having a database of people we come across we think are really great and cool, and we track them.
And is it literally when you've got a great idea, come and talk to us type discussions with the right people?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an idea, or even, hey, if you don't even want to raise capital yet, and you want to just learn how to go about raising capital, or, hey, I need some feedback on this idea. What would be attractive?
And that starts the journey.
Yeah, we love to help folks and founders well before they need the money.
Now, one of the things you've mentioned before, and we've talked about, is that the scale here. Vietnam, a domestic-focused startup, is not going to reach the big bucks that we need to get it to that. It has to reach that $1 billion ambition. Now, successful just doesn't mean someone's not successful. That has to be multi-country. It's got to be a global approach or a regional approach. Where are you looking at when you're looking at your first markets? Is it Vietnam straight into the US? Is it Southeast Asia? Is it sector specific, or how do we walk before we run type process for this as well? How do where does that work? Is there a story, or is it every situation's different, provided we can see the scalability?
Yeah, every situation is different. I do think that you can build very successful companies looking at Vietnam only, and we have invested in those type of companies. But I think getting it to a multi-billion-dollar outcome and a NASDAQ listing, I do think you have to think about a emerging Asia story from the get-go, or a U.S. market.
So either of those is probably the more likely path.
Yep.
Not to say you can't have a single country.
That's right. So you think about a emerging Asia problem. What I mentioned earlier, tech adoption's inevitable but early, and so you can almost look at any sector and think about who's solving this problem and who's using technology, I guess, in a very effective way to bring about maybe the cost advantages or the automation that can unlock scale and do it competitively across this emerging Asia market, meaning Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, not so much Malaysia and Singapore, right? And so
Singapore's a relatively small market. It's very advanced, but it's a relatively small market.
It's not just about size, but hey, what's the budget and what are the problems of the businesses and consumers in Singapore? Very different.
Very different.
From the consumer living tier 2, tier 3 cities in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And so if you're able to take that idea and center around some kind of innovation that not everyone can build, that's very hard to replicate, and go and hire a local team in the Philippines, build a local brand around that innovation, perhaps then you can be a winner in that market.
So where are the gaps at the moment? And I'm not after sort of any special secrets here, but and the reason I ask that is like fintech is been the last 3-4 years, it's 5 years, it's really been in local market and global, but particularly here, there's been a lot of change, but it's still fragmented. A lot of players. Is there an opportunity there, or is because of that it just let it sort of work itself out for a little bit? There's other opportunities, or is there any gaps you are seeing in sectors that we're not seeing enough focus on, and there isn't enough competition or people taking advantage of consumer needs, opportunities, etc. Vietnam or regionally that you see, or globally, is anything jumps out?
Well, how I describe consumer payments in Vietnam is, I would say it's very competitive. It's quite mature. It's
still fragmented.
It's fragmented, and I guess there's still there's not a lot of greenfield opportunities in consumer payments. So if you think about the other areas where there are still plenty of opportunities, you're still looking at insurance. insurance adoption here and how people perceive and use insurance in relation to the demographics, that's still a very, very big opportunity there. Lending, there's a lot of gaps around lending, and that's goes hand in hand with a lot of, I would say, landmines or pitfalls in that category, right? You need a banking partner. You need to be able to think about how you're going to differentiate, but there's a lot of unmet demand in lending.
And that's an interesting one where you've got the street-facing pawn shops, 24-hour pawn shops that are opened to fill that need because there's a gap in the middle between the traditional banks and access to funds and payday loans and things like that. Deferred payment on consumer purchases, etc. There's still significant gaps in those markets versus the fintech, the payment itself, which is plenty of opportunities.
That's right.
And less market leading, more walking in somewhere and having which one of these 5 QR codes is to be scanned today.
Yeah, and why? Is that going to? Where's the differentiation coming from? Yeah. So I think that's a key part to be able to reach scale in any of these categories. Yeah. But even in payments, I mean, if you think about kind of where innovation is in payments, globally it's B2B payments. How do you really help introduce automation, fraud detection into B2B payments?
Yes, the simplicity, the instantaneous nature of moving forward and making everyone seamless in a way.
Especially when you think about Vietnam being very much still cash driven, and there's going to be this need for businesses, whether they disperse or collect. There's automation that can be improved there. There could be, with that automation and digitization comes factoring, lending, lots of different opportunities.
Which doesn't really exist in market at the moment the way.
No, but the need is absolutely
Correct.
There.
What about other sectors? Anything else jump out? Is we saw the health sector, a lot of investment and sort of it's slowed down in recent time in health in general, but we've also seen the digitalisation domestically of Vietnamese health system, a lot happening there. Where is opportunity in the health sector? The other one is education, EdTech. You still see those as, given the demographics, you see those as opportunistic for the right concept and the right idea?
So I'll speak about education. So EdTech, we think about EdTech as augmentation or accessibility. You think about, there's no way you can replace a teacher standing in front of you, commanding attention, and having you really learn.
I've heard people argue the opposite, but I would agree with that, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to argue the fact that just standing in front of someone, commanding attention, and having the same curriculum, you're not going to have a better experience.
The outcome is going to be demonstrably better. Yeah.
That's right. So we think about EdTech as really access, especially in markets where you can't afford the education or it's too far from the place of the educator, or augmentation. You think about this helping fill in the gaps where the school is insufficient or the curriculum isn't at the same standards that people are expecting. And so couple that with 25 to 40% of household income going to education creates a pretty large market.
Okay, so another question there, Binh, is the startup funding generally. So you've obviously focused, you've got access to funds, you've brought your second fund in to look at the early stage funding. What else is happening? Is there enough money being put specifically at backing the concepts versus those who are waiting for a bit more mature stage and willing to come in? Is there enough money going into that very early stage in Vietnam at this stage?
I think capital does produce or accelerate opportunities out there. So, the companies we aren't funding, we hope the other funds are looking at and perhaps it fits more their thesis.
Are they there? We see a lot of boot camps. We see a lot of startup, collaboration sessions and awareness and training. Is money flowing from that? Is there money coming in through those means?
Yes, there is very different types of appetite from all sorts of different investors. So if you think about a investor who is going to take a team and accelerate them, and help them disconnect on an idea, that's very early, right? And so you think about the types of risks across the spectrum. I do think that there's opportunities for more capital to be able to be deployed. If you think about some of our companies, we had one of our companies just raised a $25 million Series C, right? And we're the only ones on the ground with their offices here. From our first fund, we had so our companies have raised over $1.8 billion. And if you think about us being the first investor for many of them, we want to continue building that relationship. We could have deployed a lot more capital. And so it's really about, I think, the stage of risk, and I think many of these companies are growing.
And not everyone has an appetite. I would expect a lot of them don't go anywhere. Some of them sort of morph around, and only a small portion actually go to that 1.8 billion. But that's the game. That is trying to work it, make sure you've got that depth. Not everyone has that appetite, and that's where just interesting watching the market. So you think there's room for more people to come in to back those early stages, will get better outcomes, and more money will follow in the later stages.
Yeah, just from the fact that if your companies go on to raise follow-on capital, and you have a strong relationship with your founders, that's a potential check that you could have missed, right? So there was another investor outside of Vietnam willing to go in and invest in that company.
So we do quite a lot of due diligence, particularly in the tech space, in probably sort of the Series A, Series B, they're going through, and that identifying the issues, the cleanups that they note from the investor side, coming in, looking at them, that they're now maturing. They've got a lot of issues to clean up, but the runway's there and they're happy with that. So we see that, and we usually get very positive outcomes. You've got keen investors going through those series rounds, looking more capital and wanting to see corrective actions as part of their growth. And we joke that we could probably write a lot of the findings before we start, because we see the same sort of issues arising because of the natures of founders and businesses. What do you see? You're one step earlier than that. What are some of the lessons you get out of it? Some of the things that you sort of see consistently that you treat as sort of an advice you give to other people, or lessons that you see out of your investments?
Well, so many lessons, because at the end of the day, venture capital, you're mostly wrong. Then you're correct.
As long as the good one, you get one or two good ones correct.
That's right.
Probably okay.
That's right. And so some of the major ones would be over-indexing on one's background. If you look at the resume of someone with a great education, Oxford, Stanford, Berkeley, and they have that's the right type of pedigree, and over-indexing on that can be problematic, right? I think there's a lot of folks who talk about, hey, I'm going to build a tech company, and they don't have a technical co-founder, and they maybe have an outsource type of idea. I think you got to put your money where your mouth is, right? And be able to showcase that actually this is an enabler. I believe in this, and look, it's representative of my team or my
And the knowledge is in-house, it's not in a third party.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. I think at the end of the day, you always find flaws in teams. You're never going to find a perfect team. Ideally, you think about teams, that it's a all-star team that you invest in, instead of a team that you just absolutely have to coach and trade players and everything else. But that's not always the case. And so I think there's some acceptable flaws within a team. And I think, coming in with focusing on why they want to do what they're doing, understanding that type of ambition, the mindset that they're going to continue to grow and learn on this journey. But I think most importantly that there's so much determination.
It's almost like a psychometric analysis and process you're going through.
Yeah, and I think part of it is how authentic can someone be if it's just an interview and you're asking them 1,000 questions and they're just answering. Rather, it should be a conversation between two potential partners in collaboration mode and learning to share vulnerabilities with each other and how they think through problems, right?
And that's what I would expect. Like I said, all investments that I see in Vietnam, it's time. It takes time. Relationships are important to understand. It's never just a one-off, let's meet, let's make it happen. It does take time to get to know and learn and trust.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
But there are times where you actually meet someone and they know everything about the market in the company, and that confidence is there and it feels just very authentic. That timeline's accelerated.
So I want that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just in the interest of time, my final question is, what's next? Where do you see your business going? So you've got the funds at the moment, you've got a particular style. Is it something you think that's just follow the path, it works, or are you looking at other things into the future or looking at modifying as Vietnam and Southeast Asia matures? I'm just sort of curious to what the track's going to be.
Yeah, we want to be the best VC firm in Vietnam, the go-to place for the most ambitious entrepreneurs, both foreigners who live here as well as Vietnamese who are entrepreneurial in tech, to be able to create iconic businesses recognizable outside of Vietnam. You know, here's a platform and a team with the best connections and the best value add to do that. So for us, maintaining or building that position up, but then really tracking Vietnam in terms of where it's headed. And I think Vietnam is quite differentiated in the sense of the software engineers and the kind of innovation and AI that's coming out of Vietnam.
So there's a long runway ahead.
Long runway ahead.
Fantastic, Ben. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been great to talk with you.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Looking forward to seeing it online.
Great. And I look forward to catching up next time in our next episode of Acclime Conversations. Thank you.